for about half here, but the weather must be holding us up. Nonetheless, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our conversation in the discipline. Our speakers are here today because Suny has been willing to fund this activity and to allow us to explore in some more depth adult learning in this particular kind of profession. So we then set out to identify whom we would like to hear from and how we would like to think through this. And so today's program has two major speakers. The first is Dr. Hiemstra, and the second this afternoon is Ken Leafwood. Let me just make a little bit of a connection between the morning and the afternoon and how these things are connected. There has been in the recent couple of decades a very large interest in adult learning. And as I talk to students and as I talk to people in the field and as I talk with staff developers, it becomes clear to me that adult learning is an area of great interest in staff development and in the area of instruction at the graduate level for us. And what we haven't really done, it seems to me, is to make the connection between what is in the adult learning literature and what we can use in education graduate programs, be they administration or instruction. And so this morning we are going to be hearing from Roger Hiemstra on that topic. This afternoon we are going to be working with and hearing from a professor of educational administration who has been doing work in socialization and who is very familiar with the research on socialization into educational administration. And so we have that body of literature. I see a connection between the two, but also quite a difference between the two. So I hope you'll join us for both sessions. And because we have such an intimate group, there will be lots of opportunity for question and answer. Now, Roger Hiemstra. When I first got my degree and was ready to go any place in the world to be a professor, I wound up having the best offer from Syracuse University, which, by the way, I worked in Rochester, got my degree in Buffalo. I went to Syracuse and now I'm in a school and I hate snow. So, I guess fate. But at any rate, I went to Syracuse University and joined a Department of Educational Administration which was connected with two other departments, higher education and adult education. And so the three of our programs were together in a concentration. And as a result, I worked very closely with Roger and other professors in adult education. We had quite a collegial relationship. When we set out to find a speaker for today, I went to probably the grandfather, at least in my mind, of adult ed, one of the key people, and that was Malcolm Knowles, and asked him to present. Malcolm Knowles is an elderly gentleman who felt he couldn't make the trip, given some of his other pressures, and he gave me a list of 3 or 4 people who might be willing to come and work with us. On the list was Roger. So obviously we have someone who is very highly reputed in his own field and comes to us very highly recommended. I also wanted to share with you that Roger's daughter, you may have read about it in the press recently, she won a national essay. Will be traveling abroad this recently with a chaperone. Her father.
Right. They couldn't find anybody else. So bad.
Too bad. So Roger, thank you for joining us today.
I don't know if that introduction, if Linda means I'm 3rd or 4th best or what, but you have to, I think, put up with what you have at this point. I'd like to find out a little bit about you, if I might, before I begin with some of my remarks. I know some of you are professors in educational administration. How many are that? Okay, some, I believe, Linda said, are school officials, administrators. Is that right? Okay, we have what others?
Other legal professors.
Oswego professors, yes? Okay. Students? Teacher? Staff development? Okay. How many of you have ever had any formal coursework in adult education? Couple? Okay. And I guess, how many of you regularly teach adults in your class? Most of you. Okay. Well, today I'm going to attempt to say some things that may or may not be new to some of you, but at least bring you my viewpoint of the field of adult education and what adult learning is all about, and some things, hopefully, that I can stimulate for you to think about, not only today, but for those of you that are working tomorrow on studying this more, or hopefully you can go home and dialogue with colleagues or think about it yourself. Actually, Linda gave me, I think, a very difficult task. Regardless of whether or not Malcolm Knowles recommended me on that list of 3 or 4 people, I think the fact that someone coming in from another discipline, with only 2 of you in here really who have studied adult education, I'm someone from another discipline coming in and perhaps working to try to convince you to think more about my discipline, my body of knowledge. That's a difficult task, I realize that. I tried to put myself, when I was thinking about these remarks, I tried to put myself on the other side and think about if Linda or some other professor of educational administration was coming to me to tell me about the newest things in administration, how open would I be on that? And it's difficult to really comprehend what's coming out of another discipline. So that's a tough task for me. I recognize that. I think I'll have to admit to you, there are only a couple of you that are familiar, some with adult ed, and a few of you several of you that have taught in adult education. But I'll have to tell you, I know literally nothing about educational administration or public school teaching or public school administration. And as I described to you some about my background, you'll understand why that was true and whether or not that legitimates my being able to talk to you, because I certainly am devoid of knowledge. Most of my knowledge about educational administration has come over the years with affiliating with people like Linda and others, and of course I have learned a great deal in that regard. But I don't read that literature base. So some of the things that I say may be either incomprehensible or they seem silly to you just because I've missed a point from your literature base. And I'm sure there will be times when you will want to stand up and challenge that, or to make a comment, or tell me where I've missed something because I don't know the literature base very well outside of adult education. And please feel free to do that. Certainly, another task is to stand before you for the remaining hour and 30-some minutes to try to keep your interest on this topic. So I see this as a challenge. Let me tell you a bit about my background, just so you have some depth of understanding as to why I have come to make these kind of comments today. I had a bachelor's degree in rural sociology from Michigan State University. Not a single course in teaching along the way, not a single one. Had really no inclination that I would ever be involved in teaching or in education in any kind of a formal sense. My first job, and really the one that I had prepared myself for, was as a county extension agent in the state of Iowa for a few years. During that time, I spent a lot of effort working with volunteer leader training. And that is when I first began to get at least a taste from an informal sense of working with adults and what it meant. And that was, I think, for me, moving into a professorial role in adult education was actually a very good beginning and a good background. My doctoral degree in adult education is from the University of Michigan in 1970. And I began teaching as an assistant professor at the age of 31, in 1970, at the University of Nebraska. I went back and looked at my records, because I keep all of my evaluation sheets. And there were 57 students in the 3 classes that I taught that first semester. There was only 2 of those students that were my age or younger. So that was quite an overwhelming experience for me to walk into a classroom as a young professor and find all of those people there very, very experienced, and many of them several years older than me. That first semester, I certainly began noticing some difficulties in what I was thinking about in terms of teaching. I came out using a very didactic approach because that is what had been modeled for me as I remembered in high school and certainly as I remembered in college. And so I really knew nothing other than that approach. Fairly much straight lecturing, and with various kind of testing devices along the way to see if the students had received the gospel and could parrot it back in some way. But here I was, a 31-year-old young whippersnapper, and I have, at least at that time, I had what some referred to as a baby face, or a young-looking face. I quickly grew a beard because I thought that may would help a little bit. But at any rate, here was this young person without a lot of experience. I'd only had about 4 years of experience in extension, teaching people with many, many years of experience. So at that point, after that first semester, I talked some with my departmental chair, and I began doing some experimenting and with my own teaching, and began looking at various approaches to teaching adults. It was, incidentally, it was in the spring of 1971, still within my first year at Nebraska, that I first met Malcolm Knowles. Malcolm came to the University of Nebraska to make a series of presentations to our students and to do a television show for our local educational television channel. He had just published a book called The Modern Practice of Adult Education, and I'll be saying more about that as I go throughout today, because he certainly had a tremendous influence on the thinking of adult educators and really on the thinking of a lot of people outside of adult education. Hearing him talk, hearing him describe what he called at that point the andragogical process, helped me to go through the experimenting, helped me to try a variety of things. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to cap this off today with kind of presenting to you my own teaching and learning model. It's a relatively straightforward model. And also I will have some handouts along the way that will summarize some of the things that I'm talking about. So here I am before you now, having completed 20 years of college teaching with all kinds of groups, in all kinds of settings, credit courses, non-credit courses, workshops, training sessions, regular summer session courses, intensive summer session courses, weekend courses, regular semester courses. Also last year I completed a distance education course via a mediated computer conferencing system that I can tell you a little bit about. One of the persons in this room happened to have participated in that course. And so certainly a wide variety of backgrounds and experiences to present to you today. I don't know that necessarily makes me an expert on anything, but certainly it gives me some credibility in terms of working with a wide variety of adults. I was bold enough to have worked with a couple of colleagues on 2 book projects. Those of you that saw the advanced publicity on this session, I think, as I remember, Leah and Linda put announcements on both of those books that are coming up. One is entitled Individualizing Instruction, and that one will be coming out in late summer from Josie Bass, in which my colleague Bert Siskel from University of Wyoming and I have tried to put together all of this information into a book form. Well, here is the game plan that I have for the morning, although I certainly am willing to stay flexible as things would evolve. But in terms of my preparation for today, there are 2 main topics that Linda wanted me to cover. And the first is andragogy, to talk about it. Some of you I know are familiar with it, others of you may not be as familiar with it, so I want to provide some overview information on andragogy as an alternative paradigm to teaching. Another one is self-directed learning. Closely associated with that, this is an area that really is dear to my heart. It has been my main research area for a number of years. My doctoral students and I have carried out a number of research projects in the area of self-directed learning. I talk about what we've discovered in that research in the last 20 years relative to learners wanting to take more responsibility for their own learning. But there are two, in my view, very important subtopics that I mentioned to Linda that I wanted to spend a little bit of time with you on. And one has to do with technology and the impending roles for educators related to changes in technology. I have been fortunate, I guess I would say fortunate, because it's been a lot of work and some of my own scholarship has suffered, but for the last 4 years I've been co-director of what's called the Kellogg Project at Syracuse University. We had nearly a $4 million grant from the Kellogg Foundation for a 5-year project to do a series of things with adults, all based on high technology, and I'm going to at least talk a little bit about that with you and describe how I believe technology is beginning to change what we do as educators. And then I want to kind of cap it off today with a summary of that individualizing instructional teaching and learning model that I've developed that's going to be in this forthcoming book, and let you at least take a look at it. I believe it'll be a logical extension of everything else that I talk about in the morning. And hopefully we will have a chance for dialogue as we go throughout this. I'm going to talk first about andragogy, as I said, and andragogy really stemmed from the increasing attention beginning in the early part of this century that the potential for learning extended throughout adulthood. This notion, and pardon the roughness on that transparency, I put it on one of those those small portable ones a couple of months ago, and it kind of got scorched because they're pretty hot. But this notion that old dogs can, in fact, learn new tricks. And I think this is important to what we're talking about today in terms of what's happening in the U.S. society. I'm sure this is nothing new to most of you in this room, but today the average age in the U.S. society is nearly 32 years. That average age is increasing now at about 0.7 per year. And so that means that in a relatively short time, by the turn of the next century, average age is going to be around 40. And there certainly are projections, even given the so-called baby boomlet, there still are projections that the older cohorts are going to keep increasing at a rate to keep that average moving up because of increased health care, increased longevity, that sort of thing. That presents, I think, all kinds of interesting challenges for those of us in education. I guess the news has not yet hit the papers, but the rumor floating around Syracuse University is next year we're going to be short about 300 freshmen. That kind of a statistic is being repeated in many schools. I don't know if it's hitting the Suny system yet or not, but certainly the predictions that have been coming along for many, many years is being played out in many institutions. And the notion that if those of us who are professors, several of us in this room, are studying to be a professor or want to be a professor, if we make our living from teaching people under 30, and I know many of you in ed certainly wouldn't be doing that, but many of our colleagues at Suny Oswego or at Brockport or at SU, etc., they do make their living from teaching people perhaps even 25 and younger. And that's going to have to change. You can just predict that. Iowa State University, where I taught for several years, now has nearly 1/3 of its student body over the age of 25, and that percentage is going up at that institution and many other institutions. So it's going to make a tremendous difference, I think, in the way we think about students and working with them. There has been correspondingly, because of, at the turn of the century when research started affirming that older dogs can in fact learn new tricks, there's been some corresponding research. This particular transparency here, well, that the vertical axis is learning abilities and the horizontal is depiction of research eras, so it's not easy to get quite all of it on. Jim, I hope that doesn't screw up the video camera if I move that up just a little bit. I'm not going to go through each one of those. I use this when I teach an adult learning course, but it depicts what really the slope is the most important point here. What has happened with our what we call eras of research. In the late 70s, most of the research confirmed what the brown slope shows, that the ability of adults to learn continues throughout life. It certainly changes, and I'm going to talk a little bit in a few minutes about differences between fluid and crystallized. But certainly this is what adult educators are being taught. Those of you that are thinking about adults in the classroom, you need to, if you aren't already, I'm sure most of you are well aware that this point is an important one. Now, I mentioned to you the research by Horn and Cattell and some others about fluid and crystallized. That's a real important one, I think, to at least touch upon. Mental ability has been talked about and tested and experimented, researched on by a number of people, but I like the way that Horn and Cattell and colleagues have depicted intelligence by defining it as two distinct kinds. Now, there's been a lot of controversy about this fluid versus crystallized intelligence, and some of you may have some bones to pick about it. There are parts of it that I'm not in complete agreement myself with, but at least it makes, because of the dichotomous way that they've separated this out, I think it serves the point of helping us to differentiate as people age what this may mean. In terms of fluid intelligence is thought to be primarily innate in nature, and it's related to various types of problem solving. It's what Wechsler, for those of you that have studied some of the Wechsler IQ stuff, it's what Wechsler called native mental ability. And it relates to how well an individual perceives various complex relations, how they use, say, their short-term memory, how they form concepts, how they engage in abstract reasoning. What the researchers have found is that fluid intelligence is relatively formless and appears independent of both experience and education. So some of the corresponding examples, as it's measured by various testing sources, is rote memory, common word analogies. And think about those of us that use things like Miller's analogy test as an entree point, or the GRE as an entree point. Well, I'll get to that in a little bit later. But common word analogies in verbal reasoning. And it's what one of my colleagues, Alan Knox, calls the neural physiology side of the intelligence discussion. I have two teenage kids, and one of them especially is very, very skilled in studying math, and that is the brilliance coming from the fluid side, of course. Crystallized intelligence consists of acquired abilities such as verbal comprehension, numerical skills, inductive reasoning. And it's based on what Knox calls acculturation, including the various factors learned in our schools and through our societal context. Thus, crystallized intelligence appears to be culturally based. Some examples of the crystallized intelligence includes general information, word lists, reading comprehension, vocabulary tests, and how much knowledge that the individual extracts from the social and the physical environment. Taken together, both types of intelligence covers most of the learning tasks that confront adults. And these include the overall global capacity that an adult has to learn, how they reason, and how they solve problems. Fluid and crystallized, in essence, are complementary in nature, and we find ways of using them throughout or compensating one for the other if we are in decline on either one of them. I thought that this is a nice summary of the research and what happens with age. If you can, age is on the horizontal axis, performance is on the vertical axis. And generally you can see that with age, the crystallized intelligence increases, whereas with age, the fluid decreases. But because of the compensation, of course, generally, if the right kind of IQ measures are used, generally keeps this IQ ability up. That slope then on the general IQ test is very similar to that brown line slope that I showed you on the research eras. The researchers have discovered some very interesting findings in relation now to maturation and performance. In essence, both the fluid and the crystallized intelligence generally increase through age, although the fluid starts to decrease in the teens somewhere. But at the younger ages, both are on the increase. And with the slowing of the maturation process itself, though, into puberty and just beyond, fluid intelligence reaches its peak and then generally declines throughout adulthood. So implications of this is that, for example, one study showed that when untimed tests, now that's an important concept, an untimed test where the pressure of time was not involved, when untimed tests were given, the scores related to crystallized intelligence were the same or higher in the 50s as in the 20s, i.e. the slope of that general IQ test there. Well, what does that all mean for those of us that have adults in our classroom or work with adults in some way? Well, as the fluid intelligence declines and as the crystallized intelligence increases in adulthood, general learning ability will remain stable. However, because of what is happening to the fluid, we learn how to do this compensation. We do this automatically as we age for our loss of fluid, and we rely more and more on the crystallized. And so brilliance is what is referred to as the fluid, and wisdom is what they refer to as the crystallized. And so as we get older, of course, we are in fact substituting wisdom for the brilliance. And people kind of joke about that, but that in fact is exactly what is happening. And so because of what I said just a few minutes ago, that people will score as well on various kind of IQ tests if they are not based on speed or not based on what makes up brilliance. So that's an important point to think about in terms of your own interaction with the adult learner. In more practical terms, the distinction between fluid and crystallized intelligence is useful in that it helps to explain the changes in our intellectual performance over the lifespan. Since fluid intelligence appears to be genetically based and independent, remember I said earlier it was formless, it appears to be independent of our education and our life experiences. It makes sense then that performance would decline on some of the standardized tests if they are based on things like speed, on the brilliance notion. So that if we as professors or as teachers or working with adults in any capacity, if we give tests based on fluid, based on speed, based on the brilliance, if we are doing that, something related to speed or something related to rote memory, something of that nature, in fact, we may unfairly be penalizing the older students. Now, if you think of yourself as an instructor who wants to be fair and equitable in the classroom, and you pride yourself on that, I'm saying to you, you've got to factor in the age. You just simply have to do that. Because if in your classrooms you happen to have people ranging from age 25 on up to 50, just as an example, the people at the upper end you're going to be penalizing severely if you're basing it just on the brilliance or on the speed. And kind of a corollary to that is you don't necessarily penalize the younger students if you remove the time, because there's a nice compensating balancing there that goes on with the younger learners. So I challenge you, if you haven't done this already, and I suspect many of you have, think about the nature of your evaluation, the nature of your testing. Crystallized intelligence, not only does it increase with age, and the various subtests of Wechsler and others show this, it is dependent upon experience and accumulated knowledge and the relationships that we have with our environment. So, and some of the things that I'm going to be talking about this morning back this up, I hope, I contend that it becomes imperative that we develop teaching techniques that cater to these kind of changes, making use of the reservoir of experiences, for example, that someone has. With this kind of background, and mind you, all of this research that I've talked to you now, most of it was pretty well concluded by the end of the 60s. Most of what I've talked about now is pretty solid stuff in the adult education literature from the end of the 60s on, and the field of adult education really was very ripe for andragogy and for Malcolm Knowles. And he came along at about that time. I think Linda was right. He is considered, maybe at one point he was considered the father. I think he probably is now considered the grandfather. I think Malcolm is close to 80 years old, still actively engaged in as many things as he can, although his health certainly is in decline. He probably certainly was the most prolific author in the field of adult education in the 60s and the 70s, and certainly the early part of the 80s. In 1968, actually 67, is when I believe Malcolm, he went to a conference in Eastern Europe, I think it was Yugoslavia as I recall the history on that, talked to some adult educators over there. They were already utilizing the term or the concept andragogy, and he picked it up, talked with them some, brought it back here, wrote this first article in one of our journals called Adult Leadership in 1968, spelled it at that time A-N-D-R-O-G-O-G-Y. And he had some discussion with, I think it was the Webster Dictionary people, because he wanted to get this entered into the dictionary, and they in fact helped him to come up with a different spelling. It's now A-N-D-R-A. I'm not a wordsmither, and so I'm not sure I understand quite all the derivation etymologically of words, and so I don't know why it was important to spell it andra as opposed to andro, because I believe the Europeans were using androgogy. But the stem, if you're familiar with pedagogy, the stem of pedagogy is paid, P-A-I-D, and that is, the Greek stem for that means youth. And so aner, or andra, is Greek for man. So ladies in the audience, we might want to take issue with how this was used, but that is the Greek stem derivation. And agogos, from pedagogy or andragogy, agogos, the Greek stem there is leader. And so Malcolm came up with this definition, the art and science of helping adults learn. Are you folks able to see the bottom of these transparencies? Okay, I'll try to be mindful of that. Please remind me if I forget that periodically. So andragogy, the art and science of helping adults learn. Some of the adult education historians have in fact discovered that this term was used in the 1920s by a couple of people who had come across the word in the very same way, a trip to, I think, Germany at the time, and someone was using that term there, and it just didn't catch on. It showed up in the literature in the 1920s. It didn't really catch on until Knowles popularized it starting in '68, and then his book Modern Practice came out in 1970, and it was called The Modern Practice of Adult Education, but the subtitle, if you've never seen that book, the subtitle at that time was Andragogy versus Pedagogy. And that really began to change the way adult educators thought about teaching adults. All of a sudden, there was developing some research and a literature base supporting what many of us had been discovering ourselves in terms of what worked, but we didn't have really a label to call it. I think it's interesting that several European countries use when they set up, say, their state hierarchy for education and provide their educational support back to school systems and so on, they use the term anthropogogy. And anthro comes from, I forget exactly, culture or something. I forget what the stem of that is. But anthropogogy is the overall, and then andragogy is on the adult side, and pedagogy is on the child side. And so it's a more even split in terms of the way they think about it. Well, when this book first came out, that notion of andragogy versus pedagogy really created some controversy in not only the adult education literature, but others. People were saying, you can't dichotomize it quite that cleanly. And so there was, in my own adult education literature, there was a lot of controversy and a lot of discussion about this whole technique. Just to kind of summarize this for you, at the point 1980, Knowles came up with the second edition of this book, and he admitted in a little forward in the book that he had thought about it during the decade and realized that calling this an alternative paradigm just means that, in fact, there probably are all kinds of approaches that can be used, and you don't necessarily have to have one just for adults. And he used as the subtitle, From Pedagogy to Andragogy, and so he saw this as an extended paradigm. There were several concepts within this, or basic assumptions, underlying the andragogical model. You might think about these assumptions, and I will move this screen up in a little bit. You might think about these assumptions in terms of the way that you work with your own learners, for those of you that are teaching. And this first one has to do with the concept of the learner himself or herself, that as people mature, they have this deep need to take more independence, to take more responsibility, to be self-directing. And this will tie directly into what I'm going to say in a few minutes about that whole body of research. So if in fact you can buy into this particular assumption, and in many ways, it goes along with this notion of what's happening to crystallized. As we move more and more toward the wisdom, our feelings about ourself, in fact, undergird or enhance this notion of taking more control. And so the role for the instructor, then, in my view, and in the view of others, is to engage the learners in a mutual process of learning and inquiry rather than a more didactic transmittal of knowledge. And probably I'll have a chance to say more about that as the morning goes, and I'm hoping that I'm beginning already to stimulate in you some points where you want to challenge or you want to say something about it, or talk, in fact, about how these concepts fit in with your own view of teaching and learning, regardless of the age of the student. The second one, and this ties to this notion of what's happening on crystallized in intelligence, is the importance of the role of experience for the learner. That experience itself becomes the richest resource for learning, and so analyzing and using that experience as the instructor is what becomes important. And perhaps some of you do that already in your own classrooms. That's one of the things that I attempt to do right off, is to try to understand where learners who are working with me, what is that experience base, and how can we, in fact, tie learning to that rich resource of experience and build on it. Another one has to do with, another assumption has to do with the readiness notion, that adults are ready for or motivated to learn as they experience needs or problems or interest. And learning, you try to find ways that the learning will go back and meet those needs or satisfy those particular interests. And so what I do as an instructor is I use that as starting points for many of my learning activities that I'm trying to stimulate, is to build them, base them right on real problems. And as an instructor, I will talk about what are the real problems you as the learner are facing, and how can the new knowledge help to solve those problems or meet the needs that grow out of that. The last one of these assumptions has to do with the orientation to learning, and in fact it is performance-centered or problem-centered, life-centered, however you want to refer to this. And so the appropriate unit then, I think, for organizing adult learning become life situations, not necessarily subjects. Those of us in higher education or in the public schools were often tied to subjects. That's the way we organize everything that it is that we do. And so when you're confined like that, you have to begin to think of ways that you can break down that subject into smaller components more tied to particular immediate application sorts of things. And so one of the things that I would do as an instructor, believing in this particular assumption, yes, we would go after new knowledge, but I would always ask the learners to think about ways, how do you make immediate application of that? How is that going to affect your behavior as a principal or as a superintendent or as a continuing education administrator? And I spend a lot of time as the professor trying to stimulate learners to think about, okay, here's a new theory on organization or on program planning or something like that. How do we take that new information, translate it to our job or to a job that's coming up? So there is real logic, I think, into how these assumptions tend to undergird this and how you can use them as the instructor. So tied to this is the notion of how adults generally look at themselves. How do they see themselves? And this is sort of a summary of some of the points that I've already made, but adults generally see themselves as independent individuals, able to make and carry out decisions. So that can become a real strong resource in the classroom if you build on that. With a didactic approach, for example, primarily lecturing approach, that does not necessarily build upon this notion of independence and carrying out decisions. So you may want to quarrel about that if you use a particular kind of a teaching approach. What I said earlier, that they tend to be problem-focused, problem-centered rather than the subject-centered, and then this notion of difference. That can be a very important tool, can be a very exciting tool in the classroom in terms of stimulating discussion. But they have different backgrounds and responsibilities. All of the things that, in fact, enhance the growth of crystallized are important in adults when you ask them in research modes. In fact, they see themselves in that way. Now here is a simplified version of a teaching and learning model that grew initially out of the work of Knowles. And it's a fairly straightforward model, a very logical sort of thing. There's not going to be much in the way of surprises there for you, except perhaps for the way the instructor visualizes himself or herself. And trying to depict this is difficult when you're looking at a two-dimensional transparency. So placing the instructor in the middle and talking about the instructor as a dynamic decision maker, worrying about the whole process, is one way of visualizing that. And part of what cannot be depicted very well in that particular transparency is some of the early roles of the instructor, and that's setting up a learning climate. And this is one of the things that Knowles talked about very early as being very important. And setting up a process so that this whole model is participatory in nature, building on people's experiences and a desire to be a part of it. And so then the rest of it probably makes pretty good sense to you when you think about this notion of a dynamic participatory process undergirding this, and the fact is you start from needs. Now, some instructors perhaps have not thought about that, though, as a component within the teaching and learning process. If you start from the perception of the learner and his or her needs, as opposed to your own perception as the expert, as the professor, which is sort of basic to either a didactic or a Socratic teaching approach, where you think of yourself as the expert who assesses the need. What, from an adult education viewpoint, what we would say is, because this is a participatory process, you make the assessment of need a part of the whole thing, and you in fact find out this wealth of resources in terms of experience and desires and where they are on any growth curve. And so assessing the need becomes a part of the whole process, which means you don't pre-plan everything within a course, and that sometimes that's very, very difficult. Obviously, my making a presentation like this today, I've had to do some advanced work in pre-planning on that. And the same thing when you're teaching a course, you do a lot of pre-planning. But if you can build in some assessment of need, and you use some of that individual assessments of interest and needs and where they are on problems to design the objectives, or perhaps to refine objectives that you have attempted to establish ahead of time, then you plan whatever the instructional program is going to be, you find the resources, you implement them, you carry them out, you evaluate them, and then I add this important one here. Knowles called this the re-diagnosis of need as you go through the instructional process. I like to simply say it's a feedback and modification loop. If you're familiar with the old system analysis language, it makes more sense to me. But or if you see it as a re-diagnosis, then the notion of understanding needs is a circular sort of thing that goes throughout the learning experience. I want to read one of the things that Josie Bass does real well as a publisher. I like working with them. This is the second book that I worked with Josie Bass on, and they have a real neat way, I think, of reaching a wide variety of readers, not only just your main audience, but others. And so one of the things that they did in this book is that they had Bert and I develop from our own experience a series of vignettes. So if you ever have a chance to see this book, you'll see these vignettes, or short little stories throughout the book trying to illustrate points. I'm going to read one of these to you. It's not very long. I think it illustrates fairly well teaching approaches and how this can be problematic when you're working with adults. This comes from a true story, by the way, in Onondaga County. This is, the names have been changed, but this is a true one. So I'm going to refer to this man as Joe Daniels. Joe Daniels, 43 years of age, had been working on the production line in the local tool and die factory for 25 years. There had been rumors for the past few years that many of the production workers would be replaced by robotic machines to be installed any day. Joe and his friend Barney were talking about these looming changes one day after work. Barney said, "If we don't do something soon about these robots and computers taking over everything, we'll be out of a job." Later that evening, Joe was talking to his wife Helen about these changes. I happen to know both Joe and Helen by a different name, and so this is why this story really is a very poignant one for me. Their conversation eventually focused on what Joe could do to improve his job skills. Helen mentioned the nearby community college that she thought had worker retraining programs. Joe decided to check out what was possible. The next day, as soon as his shift ended at 3, he drove out to the college and tried to discover what was possible. Eventually, he found the Career Counseling Center and described his situation to the receptionist. He then found himself in conversation with a vocational education specialist and was encouraged to enroll in an introductory course on computer science scheduled to begin the next week. When Joe entered the classroom the following Tuesday afternoon, he was a little late because he had encountered some difficulties with traffic and finding the right room. The teacher gave him a mild tongue lashing for not being on time. Then when Joe looked around, he discovered that he was one of the oldest people there, and his graying temples were clear evidence. That, of course, is changing all the time in terms of the aging classroom, but at this particular one, he was one of the older ones. The instructor continued his discussion of the course requirements and the importance of keeping up with all the reading assignments. He then noted that each person should look at the person in the chair to the right and then to the left. He exclaimed, "The chances are very high that at least one of the people you looked at will fail this course. And remember, 2 people looked at you, too." The instructor then began 2 hours of continuous lecturing from the textbook he had authored and how important it was for each learner to memorize the contents. When Joe raised his hand to ask a question about a word he did not understand, the instructor said, "Why is it that the gray-haired ones in my class always are the first ones to not understand something?" Joe began to wonder if he had made a mistake in going back to school. Now, when Joe described that, his name wasn't Joe, but when he described that story to me, it made me very sad to think that here, in fact, was an instructor that had these kind of views about learners. My point in including that story, although Joe was just at the beginning stages of some higher education, and he eventually went on to get a technical degree at CCBI in town, and got a nice job working with computers. But I believe that this story epitomizes what many adults of various ages and stages of their education can experience in the classroom. I don't believe that that story really is a very big step from what community college classrooms can be across the state to what classrooms might be at SU or Suny Oswego or Suny Brockport or other places. I'm not suggesting any of your classrooms would be like that. But I was shocked several summers ago. This is another true story. Several summers ago, I was summer of 1981, I was a visiting professor for 6 weeks at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And the chair of the department there had long been an adult education colleague and friend of mine, but I knew nothing about his teaching or his view of the world. And he's quite famous. I mean, if I mentioned his name to you, many of you in here would know him. I probably said too much already, Yvonne. But I was quite shocked to find out that, in fact, if you can believe this, at least he did this in 1981, he locks the classroom door at the stroke of the hour when the class is to begin. He lets nobody in out during the class. I wonder what happens if somebody has diarrhea. He lets no one out. He lets no one in if they come late. Now that is his particular view of the world, and he gives people a 0 for the day if they're late or if they don't make it, regardless of what the situation is, car crash or whatever. They happen to get a 0 for the day. So I was quite shocked to find that out, and he obviously ties in a very formal and a very rigid way 3 teaching approaches. And so I'm going to move that up at least a little bit and hope that I can get most of it on the screen there. He probably ties in, at least he did at that time, fairly rigidly to a didactic approach. And which surprised me a little bit. Of course, practicing what you preach is not necessarily always an easy thing to do. Most of us recognize that. But he actually writes about adult learning and about adult teaching. This is why I was so shocked to find out about his particular approach to his view of the world. And he obviously ties into this notion of the role of the instructor, where the instructor controls most of the direction as the expert through probably primarily a lecturing format. And learners are expected to acquire that information in probably a rote memory way and parrot that back in some kind of a testing procedure. I don't know if the testing procedure would even be timed-based. It wouldn't surprise me if it was or not. Now, given what I've said earlier, you can see how difficult this would be for the learners in the classroom. Think about the 36-year-old mother with 2 small children rushing to the classroom. Babysitter was late, arrives 2 minutes after the classroom, the door is locked, 0 for the day. Think about the 55-year-old continuing education administrator in that classroom, very busy professional, trying to improve himself, Fluid is not what it used to be. Crystallized is pretty good, but he's got to memorize all of this stuff and probably do it on a time test. So there are some real severe implications from someone adhering strictly to the didactic. Some people, of course, make real good use of a Socratic method. There are certainly times when I use aspects of the Socratic method. And here the instructor uses a questioning format to move the learners through some sequence of learning. And perhaps some of you are very skillful in using aspects of a Socratic method. It probably is going to be no surprise to you, based upon what I've said already, that what I advocated is a facilitative teaching and learning process. And here is where the instructor creates an educational environment in which the learning can occur. And in this kind of a setting, and I'll say a little bit more about it as we go, in this kind of setting, of course, a wide variety of instructional techniques are used. You attempt to assess the needs. You attempt to build on experience and an analysis of problems that the learners may have. And in fact, learners are expected in this teaching and learning approach to take on increasingly more responsibility for their own learning as they go throughout the process. And so I find myself doing a lot more stimulating in the beginning when I teach, using some, of course, some didactic. I obviously do some lecturing, and using some Socratic methods. But as I go through, say, a 15-week semester with a student, we'll move increasingly more to a facilitative process by the end. And of course, there are eclectic blends of all three of these, and there perhaps are other approaches that I've not thought about that should be up on this transparency. I think I'm not going to, I have several transparencies here that I debated putting up. I think I'm not going to put them up just because they contain a lot of information. And I'm just going to summarize a few of them for you. Going back now to that circular model that I showed to you earlier, I'm going to just expand a little bit on that. When I said that the educator, the teacher, is in the middle as this dynamic, what I would call now, facilitator of the process. What she or he does, in my view, is spend some time, and I'll talk about this right at the end of my talk today in terms of this individualizing instructional process model I'm going to present to you, but spend some time thinking about this learning environment. What are you going to set up? What are you going to facilitate? How can you make use of crystallized intelligence? How can you make use of the experience? How can you set up a mutual learning process? And I really spend some time thinking about that. And that kind of language actually shows up in the course syllabus. Because I want students to have a fair shot at what my thinking is so that they can challenge it too. And trying to set up a fairly non-threatening, non-competitive kind of an environment. Competition is based primarily on fluid ability. My 16-year-old son loves the competition that goes on in a math class or a physics class. He loves to do someone better than someone else because he could beat them on this particular time test. Now, when he is probably 51, he won't feel quite the same way. I'm that way now. If I am ever in a situation where I've got a real speed is a problem for me, I get very tense and apprehensive about all of that. So you try to set up a situation, and one of the things that I do is try to build a process where people can become acquainted with each other and kind of get people relaxed and comfortable and go through an introduction process and build up a more informal kind of setting. I try to set up this planning, what I call this planning mechanism, which in fact enables them to understand that assessing needs is going to be something that they can do and that will be paid attention to in the classroom. And so, for example, paper and pencil tests or small group techniques can be used to do some diagnosis of needs. Obviously, when you're planning a course, you've got to do some of the advanced planning yourself. You absolutely have to. But some of the refinement of that can be done by the input of the learners themselves. So setting up a mechanism and so that they can understand that they will be a part of this process. Setting up objectives based on that. Most of you have done that till you're blue in the face and are very skilled at setting up objectives. That's no different in this kind of a process than any other process. Implementation, the only thing I would say about implementation is the fact that I try to use a wide variety of techniques. Research tends to support me here that when you can, in fact, work toward a lot of sensory modalities, try to, because crystallized intelligence is based upon acculturation and a lifetime of experiences and so on, some people learn better with different kinds of modalities than others. And so if you use only one modality, again, you may in fact be penalizing certain kind of learners. So you might think about increasing the variety of the techniques that you use. Evaluation, I might say just a little bit about evaluation. As an instructor, I use a learning contract approach. And that kind of goes along with this notion of facilitation and mutual inquiry, but each individual being able to build upon his or her own particular set of experiences and their particular view of the world and their particular problems that they have and need to solve. And so the learning contract allows you to individualize this in some ways. And perhaps the best book on learning contracts was written by Malcolm Knowles, a Josie Bass book of about 4 years ago. But a lot of people have written about the use of learning contracts. And this, in fact, comes around to help, I think, the instructor and the learner at the evaluation time. Because you pre-plan as much as you can how, in fact, that learner is going to be evaluated. And so it probably is no surprise to you that I use very little formal, what I would call formal testing. Occasionally I do, because some learners want that. I'm much more inclined to have learners come up with their own individualized way of evaluation. And that may be being evaluated by someone other than me, depending upon what it is they're picking up their most experience in. For example, if someone is in a class that I'm teaching on, say, program planning and evaluation, and if their main objective is to learn how to put on a workshop because they want to get a job as a continuing education administrator and be a workshop coordinator, if what they want to do is learn how to do that within that course, they're much better off, I think, being evaluated by those that participate in a workshop. So they might actually plan a workshop during that course and put it on, and much of their evaluation would come from the participants. They will learn more from that. I can give them certain kind of evaluations, but I can't give them all of them. You may have questions about evaluation later on that I can talk about. I wanted to say just a few things about a couple of other areas before I move to the self-directed learning topic. And Linda, why don't I give you all of these, and then these are in, I believe, the order that I will need them. And so just in a second I'll ask you to hand around that top one. You can just move that. One of the other areas of research that I have spent some time on, and that unfortunately I think few too many of my adult education colleagues are spending time on, has to do with the learning environment itself. I think it's very important to pay attention to the learning environment, to understand the physical aspect of how an older adult interacts with each other and with the environment. And so this sheet that's coming around to you, what I've tried to do, this in fact is a figure from chapter 6 in that book. I'm not trying to just sell my book. It's just that this book is directly, I think, germane to much of what we're talking about today, so it was very handy for me to pull out some examples and some materials from that. This particular figure may be of value to you to think about. It's a series of little triggers that you can think about in terms of the classroom. And if you're concerned about issues of seating, of furnishings, general concerns of sensory, here's an important one. And just to give you one example of why this is important, as we age, most of you are right there with me, as we age, we begin to sag and droop and drop and expand and have various kinds of physical ailments. I have the common, I think, man in his 51 years of age problem. I have lower back problems. I have to constantly watch my lower back. I have to be very particular in terms of the kind of chair that I sit in. And so you as an instructor may in fact need to take care of that if the age range within your classroom is quite a bit, and you have older people in there who need to take care with lower back problems, you may have to do something about it. Every once in a while I teach a course, I don't know how many of you have been in Huntington Hall, the series of classrooms down on the first floor within Huntington Hall School of Education's main building in Syracuse University campus. They have terribly uncomfortable classes or chairs in those classroom ring 101 through 106, very uncomfortable. The first thing that I do when I'm teaching in that classroom, the very first thing that I do is I tell the set of learners, please feel free to carry in your own chair, to bring in cushions, to get up and walk around with your hat if you have to, because an hour in one of those chairs, if you have small back problems, is absolutely murder. Another problem is, and I'm also in this case, I have arthritis relatively bad in both knees, but especially bad in my right knee. And when I sit at a chair with a table, if you have a writing area, I have to get that leg up off the ground. I absolutely have to, or in 30 minutes I'm in real agony. So I like to cross my legs, and that takes the pressure off. Sometimes some chairs and some tables are built in such a way that you can't do that. They have a little support beam down there. And so as a learner, what I have to do is I have to get up and walk around, or I have to turn sideways in my chair. Well, there are going to be a lot of people in your classroom with a variety of those kinds of needs. What I've tried to do in this handout for you is to highlight what some of these are, and you may want to think about some of them. I'm going to turn now to self-directed learning. That other main topic that Linda wanted me to present some information to you on. And the best definition comes from guess whom? Malcolm knows. As I told you, Malcolm was a very prolific person. His name does show up down at the bottom there. But basically, self-directed learning is a process where individuals take their own initiative. And it ties in pretty much with what I've said up to date, I hope. They take initiative in diagnosing their needs, in formulating their goals, in identifying resources, and choosing those resources and carrying them out and evaluation. So I am going to move this up because I know some people are having trouble reading all of those lines. This ties, I think, in with what I've already mentioned about the importance of building upon the experiences that people have when they come to the learning setting. And self-directed learning, with this definition, ties well into the andragogical process. It's interesting that these lines of inquiry, in fact, were parallel at almost the same point in time. And they discovered a lot of the same things. They finally came together in the late 70s when Knowles himself began using a lot of the self-directed material in his own work. And from about 1977 on, then Knowles simply incorporated most of the research on self-directed learning into his work with andragogy. And so I find that interesting that they were discovering the same thing with two parallel tracks, which says an epiphany for me that I think there's something very good going on there. I don't know, is our Canadian friend here yet? Dan? You're going to have a speaker here this afternoon from Oise, Toronto, and he, in fact, probably knows a man by the name of Alan Tuff. I mention that name to you because most people credit Alan Tuff with doing most of the initial research related to self-directed learning. There were aspects of it being done earlier than that, but most of it came from him. In 1964, he studied at the University of Chicago and began to do some research. It eventually became his dissertation and eventually became a book called The Adult Learning Projects. Out of that grew this whole notion of self-directed learning. But just let me say just a few things about it. This is trying to depict here, not perhaps very well, but trying to depict an iceberg with this portion up here being the water line. And what he for those of you that can't see the bottom part, it just simply says the adult learning phenomena. He used a research approach, sort of a quasi-qualitative approach. It was what's called a prompter interview technique. He had a series of prompt questions, but it was a treed sort of a thing where the interviewer could take the learner in a lot of different directions. So that's why I say it was kind of a quasi-qualitative technique. Interviewed a number of people and discovered several things about the adult learning phenomenon. One was that only about 20% of what we knew about adult learning up until the point of his research, late 60s, early 70s, his book, the first edition of it, came out in 1971. And as I say, it was parallel but fairly separate from the andragogical work because Alan was doing his work in Canada primarily. About 20% of what we knew about adult learning was what was identified by these researchers as more the institutionalized form. There was a lot of adult learning going on, no surprise to most of you, except that people didn't really recognize it and call it as adult learning under the surface of the water, more or less. The kind of stuff that people were doing independently, outside of an institution, on their own. And that was a very interesting part of the research, and he used the iceberg metaphor in his book, and that caught on with people. And people began to say, okay, we have to recognize that adult learning perhaps is more than just formal classroom. And what distinguished this outside of the formal classroom? Well, a more informal kind of an approach, people learning on their own, by themselves, using their experiences, using the wisdom that came with the crystallized intelligence, doing kind of their own informal learning contract, finding mentors, all of the things that turned out to be parallel to what was going on in the andragogical stream was being discovered by Alan and his colleagues in the research as actually what was happening. And so there were a number of researchers, including myself. I did the first large-scale study using Alan's methodology. I happened to just accidentally meet Alan at a national conference in 1972. I hadn't read his book, hadn't really heard about it because it was more Canadian-based at that point. And I was very intrigued. This is a summary of some of the research on self-directed learning. I was very intrigued. He gave a presentation at this conference about his research approach and what he had found. And so in throughout the 70s and the early 80s, there was a stream of research projects going on using this probing technique, this quasi-qualitative technique. And within this probing technique, they were discovering what I can summarize here to you now. There have been some 60, 70 studies in various kind of settings using this same methodology, and we pretty well have now a solid picture of what they were discovering about learning. And this first one, about 90% of adults conduct at least what he called one major learning effort a year. This may be enrollment in an educational administration class at Suny Oswego, but it may also be something more likely they were doing it on their own. They were learning how to do genealogy because they wanted to study the family tree, or their assessment on their houses just went up through the roof, and so they were learning everything that they could about how to appeal a tax assessment and going through that process. So what he would call learning, a major learning effort. And everybody conducts, at least 90% of the people conduct at least one of these each year. The average learner conducts 5 of these. And this is what was most startling about it and why this iceberg notion became true, the idea that some 80% of what was going on was not, therefore, up to that point recognized. The average person, this may or may not seem startling to you. I think it's fairly significant. The average person spends about 500 hours a year in what now is called adult learning. I think that's fairly significant. Obviously, if you're working full-time on a doctoral program, you're going to be spending more than that. But for the average person out there, Joe Daniels on the tool and die line, for example, spending some 500 hours a year in learning relating to life and, or hobbies or travel or something of that nature. 75% of the learning projects are motivated by some anticipated use of the knowledge. So we're going right back again to this whole notion of crystallized and the value of basing your learning on knowledge and experience. Now, where self-directed learning, because this was not called self-directed learning in 1971, this was called the Adult Learning Projects. But the most significant thing that began popping out of this research is this last point. And this is pretty well held true now on the average with all of this research. That about 75% of the learning projects are planned by the learner herself or himself. And so Tuff called this self-planned learning. He started using that term in about 1974. And then I forget how it turned over. By about 75 or 76, it was being referred to as self-directed learning. Another book that I've got coming out at the end of the year with another colleague that Linda will know, a colleague at Ralph Brockett, who also used to be at Syracuse University. We've kind of changed that concept around. I'm not going to get into it at this point. We call it self-direction in learning. We thought self-directed was too confining. But at any rate, 75% planned by the learner himself or herself. Now, if you think about what I've said up to date about the andragogical model or the facilitator's model, basing it upon a person's experience, basing it upon what's happening with crystallized intelligence as you grow older, and think about it for your own classroom, what it at least said to me as I got into this literature, it said to me, and in 75 I really began changing my teaching approach to say, I've got to build this into my teaching more. I've got to help learners build on this notion that they want more control, they want more responsibility. Given the choices, they want to plan a lot of their learning, and so that's why I came to what I'll refer to you in a few minutes to the individualized learning approach. All right, with that notion, what that says in terms of the classroom is, that says, all right, I promise you'll have a bigger say in running the flock. The student in the classroom, given everything that I've said thus far, if you're buying into some of it, and some of you may want to challenge it, but if you're buying into it, it in fact says that the learner in your classroom wants to have a much bigger say in what's going on. They want to take more responsibility for what's going on. And so I'm challenging you, and that's why you're looking at adult learning in the administrative professions. You're looking at this body of knowledge to say, what might it offer to me? And here's one of your epiphanies, perhaps. I'm saying to you, look at your own teaching approach. Can, in fact, you find ways of giving more control back to the learner? The learners are asking for it. At least the research that I'm aware of is verifying it. I'm going to go through this. I'm being a little long-winded here. I'm going to go through these very, very quickly. I'm just going to put these up just to summarize what some of the various research. As I said, a number of us have been working in this area, and I've had a number of doctoral students at Syracuse University finish dissertations in this area, and at other institutions, a lot of research going on. This seems to be what is being confirmed through the research when you look at self-directed learning. These are the benefits of this notion of learners taking more charge of their learning. There seems to be a greater transfer of the learning from one situation to another. In other words, if you learn how to take control of your learning in this setting, you're much more able to take control in another setting. There seems to be increased retention. 2 studies now have shown this notion of increased retention. That's a very powerful, tempting thing. We need more research on that, but that's a very powerful and tempting sort of thing. And I was real surprised because I hadn't anticipated that. I thought it'd be probably about the same, but at least the research is suggesting increased retention. For those of us in adult ed, those of us making our living from running lifelong learning programs or continuing ed programs, that top one is a real important one. Self-directed learning seems to stimulate a greater interest in continuing the learning. For me, that's a very satisfying one as an adult educator. I've had now 4 of my students do dissertations on number 4, and it is confirmed now. I can tell you with 4 of them, and I'm absolutely convinced that self-directed learning enhances, improves the self-concept. Four of my students looked at different age ranges, and I'm very satisfied that that's a very solid finding now. It enhances the self-concept. So when you think about certain kind of learners, especially those that might be coming from more disadvantaged settings or may have lower self-concepts, displaced homemakers, for example, this is a very important, powerful one, I think, to think about. You can enhance self-concept through giving more responsibility back. Logical, yes, but the research is confirming it. And then this notion, I read one study last year, one doctoral student talked about that involvement from a self-directed approach helped learners develop patterns for problem solving and approaching problems in some new ways. They seem to have increased ability to do that. Okay, I'm going to give you very quickly now, this is going to be perhaps more rapid fire than you want, but I've been blabbering on, pardon me, we're crystallized, so I'll be real careful on that. Not all of us in the room. Here are some of the activities that you might think about. These are some of the activities now that I use in my classroom that I've developed over the years as ways of building on self-directed notion. This notion of an individualized personal investigation based upon some needs, an analysis of their own needs. They discover some item related to your classroom or your subject matter, and they go through a personal investigation of just that topic. No one else in the class might do that at all, but for them it's very, very important. And they can do that, obviously, in a number of ways. Self-guided reading. Now, I use in the class what I call an interactive log. An interactive log means that I provide for the student a technique that they can guide their own learning. It's a way of going through an index, a table of contents, picking out the material, and then going through and writing some challenging comments to the author as you're going through the book. And they kind of guide themselves through their own learning. Another one that has been, I think, successful that I like to use what I call a study group. You put 3 or more people together in a small group, and they do kind of a group self-directed activity about some particular project. Some of you may have used similar kind of techniques in your own classroom, but it seems to work quite well. Taking them on some sort of a study tour. I and my colleagues at Syracuse do this in a number of ways. Just as an example, I teach a course called Community in the Adult Educator. We're helping students learn how to better utilize resources. So we go out and look at resources in the community. We go over to, the planned community by Baldwinsville, Radisson. We go there and take a tour there and see how they've thought about the notions of community. Perhaps involving them in some sort of a formalized correspondence course, maybe as a part of your course, maybe as outside of that. Giving them some kind of a directed learning. Now, I haven't talked at all about cognitive styles or learning styles in here, and we could spend a lot of time on that. Not every learner is going to fit in as a field-independent person. There are some people that are going to be very dependent upon the instructor, and you may have to give to them specialized directed learning. They will ask for it. But if you give them ways within that, provide for them ways within that they can still have self come up as they're doing that, it can be very, very successful. I have put together for a number of my courses a variety of learning packages. Over the years, I have developed a variety of what I call learning kits. These are audio, video, some of them are written materials, and I provide these learning packages on various kind of topics so that if one particular individual is interested in some subject, I might have a learning kit on that they can use. Sometimes you will find some programmed instruction material that they can find related to that can be helpful, can take them out on some topic that you don't have the expertise on yourself. And then I am becoming more and more, because of the experience that I had last semester. Yvonne Petrella was a member of that course. She may have her own particular views about the course, but I felt that it was quite a successful using a CMC, a computer-mediated conferencing package that we have that resides on our mainframe at Syracuse University, and all of the students dialed in via a modem and interacted to me in an asynchronous way. I mean, none of us, hardly ever were we live time. We were asynchronous. And so I might send a challenge to Yvonne, and she would write some materials to me, and 2 days later I would come back and evaluate that material and send, and then she would send a response to another student, that sort of thing. And so computer-assisted instruction in various ways seems to build on these notions of self-directed learning quite well. The only other one on this one that I would mention that I didn't show, talking about internships or practicums, and I try to use what I call mini internships within a semester-long course. If a person wants to learn a particular topic, I might have them go out and spend 30 hours with some agency studying that. Again, quickly, I'm now perhaps pushing the limits on crystallized here, but my latest kick, that's a wrong way of saying it, I guess, as a researcher, but the latest area that I am now doing some research on and trying to find my other students to do some research on, what are all of the variables within the classroom that can in fact be controlled in some way by learners? And how can I help people like yourselves think about some of these components or variables within the classroom and ways that the student can himself or herself control that? I'm going to suggest several of them for you, and I'm going to go over them quite quickly. One, obviously, is the identification of needs. That can be a very individualized sort of thing. I use a paper and pencil kind of a thing to get students started on it. It becomes very individual, and then they take those needs and try to translate them into their individualized learning activities. Perhaps looking at specificity within topics or the purpose for the learning activity itself. This will be a very hard one for most of you to give up control on. And I've been there. I know that it is, because if you have a class that you're teaching on a particular subject, you have a purpose in mind. And to give up much control on that is very, very difficult. And I'm trying to do more work in that area to better understand that. Certainly, objectives is one of the other areas. The objectives or objectives for the expected outcomes is another thing that you can have specificity within the realm of each individual learner. In other words, if someone is going to learn how to evaluate a conference, they don't necessarily have to have the same objective about how they're going to do that as the person sitting next to them. The appropriateness of the learning resources. Some students, because of learning style differences or cognition differences, will choose different kind of approaches. They will like, in fact, kits, or they would prefer to be in a small group and do something with others, or they would prefer to do something on a computer-assisted module in some way. And so they can determine the appropriateness of the learning experiences. What this has meant for me as an instructor, though, is that I have to have prepared for any one of my courses a lot more learning options. And so there's a lot more upfront work that has to be done on any one course. And you can't do this the first time through. I mean, I feel that I can't have a course that's really what I feel good about until I've taught it about 3 times. It takes me that much time to figure out what's going on and to provide and build the resources and that sort of thing. Trying to identify their own learning resources outside of what you can present to them. This has been a real interesting thing in having students themselves determine what are the best learning resources outside of what the instructor could ever think about. I've said a little bit about the learning environment, but having learners themselves put some control over the nature of the environment. And so if you like to arrange students in a particular way, but you find students that doesn't fit for that particular students, they might see the physical environment in a way different from you. So you should think about giving them up some control. Certainly the time requirements. If you have deadlines and dates that don't always match, that's a difficulty when there are institutional requirements that you also have to adhere to. Syracuse University, for example, has become cracking down on incompletes. I used to give a lot of incompletes in courses because of the timing, or this next one I would put up here, the pace of the learning. And Syracuse University, they don't like that anymore, and they put out some statements saying they don't want us to give incompletes anymore. So I've had to rethink a lot about timing and pacing. And certainly the method of evaluation, I've already talked about that. And then this latter one is one that I'm excited about finding out more about, but that's the methods of documenting. And so how do learners convince themselves, and sort of coincidentally you as the instructor, that they have documented, in fact, their learning. And what does that mean? Does it mean a written material? Does it mean an evaluation by an outside person and some written comments on that? I don't know much about that yet, except to say that I think that's one of those variables. I'm sure there are many other variables, and when we dialogue in a few minutes, you probably will come up with some yourself. I'm not allowing a lot of time. Let me just say something quickly about the Kellogg project, and you can hand out those next three. I mentioned earlier this Kellogg project and this grant that we had from the Kellogg Foundation to disseminate adult education materials, and we're doing a lot of different things, but because I believe technology is going to, if it hasn't already, it's going to impact very dramatically on the roles of all of us, regardless of our setting, I wanted to say just a few things to you about it. For example, in our office, we all now are on a LAN, a local area network. It's an electronic connection of staff, faculty, and students. And I think that's very, very important. Coming around to you is some discussion or descriptions of a basic one on the Kellogg project itself. There's one about AidNet, which is our electronic network. And if any of you are interested and you have some sort of a gateway through to BitNet, and there are a lot of entrees to BitNet nowadays. If you have a gateway to BitNet, you could become a part of AidNet if you wanted. AidNet, an adult education network started by the Kellogg project, originally was just for adult educators, but in fact now it has broadened out, and there are a number of people outside of adult ed that are a part of this network. And then about the electronic journal that we publish out of AidNet. And just a few things about some of the future things coming. Of course, most of you already are, I suppose, heavily involved with personal computers and your own word processing or so on. But the electronic networking that's possible because of that is and will affect all of us. Electronic teaching, as I mentioned to you, this software that we have on our VAX mainframe at Syracuse University called Participate, or Party for short. And in fact, it is a way, it's sort of an advanced version of electronic mail because you can do a lot more with it, and it's a menu-driven kind of thing. This one is worth putting up on the screen, I think. These are some of the new roles that I believe many of you will see yourself being faced with because of what's happening with technology. That first one there is called an information counselor. I hadn't even heard of the term 4 years ago when we started this project, and yet I realize now that a lot of what I am doing because of the electronic technological changes that are impacting on me as a professor has to do with that, and that is counseling people on how to utilize information, how to access it, how to interpret it, how to share information. Being this facilitator of electronic teaching that I mentioned. I had to rethink my whole approach to teaching when I taught that computer-mediated conferencing course. I was able to adapt some things, some other things I had to come up with as brand new. Some of you may be faced with that if you aren't already. Being mentors, being communicators yourself, managing the teaching process for other teachers because of the various kind of electronic expert systems that are becoming available to us. I did want to say just a brief word, and then you can pass that last one around if you haven't already, Linda. There's nothing magical about this particular model, but this is the model that my colleague Bert Sisko and I have come up with. We call it the individualized instructional process model. It's very similar to some of the things that I've said to you already. The notion here in this 6-step model is that I believe that there are a lot of activities prior to the first time you meet with your learners that are very important to think about. And on this last one coming around, it's on both sides. I've taken these 6 steps and I've asked a number of questions within each of these steps for you to think about. And in terms of what we call activities prior to the first session, or some pre-planning activities, a series of questions. I haven't seen that research, and I would be surprised if that showed it in quite that way, because some people can compensate much more than others as they get older. They discover new skills. You see, the problem, because it's an acculturation kind of in a variable, there are a lot of unpredictables, a lot of unknowns along the way, and there gets in there notions about life experiences and about self-concept and a whole series of things that fluid doesn't really account for. And so you hear all the time of these people that all of a sudden, age 50 or 60, they discover this innate learning ability. And really, I think what it is, if you get right down to it, is a huge ability in terms of compensation and using life experiences and enhanced self-concept. And it may or may not have anything to do with how they did. Most likely, it didn't have anything to do with how they did as a younger person.
Okay, let me ask another question. One of the ways in which programs appear to be evaluated, at least at national level, seems to be the percentage of applicants who are accepted into the program. And
often GRE scores or Miller analogy scores.
I don't even know what they're using as criteria for doing that, but I hear that program evaluation and the grade
that may use admission criteria that are more fair, if you will, to the aging student may be penalized by that. Those are not probably very satisfying words to you, and I suppose we need to change the system in some way. I know when we were getting ready for an intake visit the last time, I made a special point of talking at length about our admission procedures and what we use, because I wanted the people reading the materials to understand that we looked at a whole series of things besides just the scores. Now, we don't accept 100% either, because we don't have room for 100%. But we would not cut people off based upon some percent criterion that we had or some quota that were given to us unless it was mandated and completely outside of our control. As an example, last year we accepted, I think, 30 or 40% of our doctoral applicants. This year we accepted about 95%. But it just happened to be that they all fit the criteria and we felt very good about it. And we didn't have a problem with that. That doesn't mean that the outside evaluators will. You have to often, I think, see, that's one of the problems with a lot of what I talked about today. It doesn't go along with sort of the standard idealized approach for working with students, and so you have to spend a lot of your time fighting and defending and explaining and all that sort of thing, and that can take some resources.
We need to identify variables that really are at play versus variables that are more likely to be at play.
Identification of those variables to administrators, because many of the evaluators, the outside evaluators or the central administrators, they're not going to understand or really care about what much of, I'm being a little crass here, but they're not going to care as much about some of the things that we've talked about today, because many of the administrators are using as a frame of reference much more what I would call a traditional or a didactic approach to instruction, and much of current day higher education is based on a much more traditional model, and so you have to work to change those opinions.
And one last question: if students take increasing control of their learning, and indeed are probably involved in learning that's not either closely monitored or closely guided or closely directed by the department and the professor in the program, then how do we go about thinking about program effectiveness?
Well, I might challenge the notion of what is closely monitored. It seems to me in what I've talked about today, even the individualized instructional process model, I think the instructor has a responsibility both to the institution and to the learner to do some of the monitoring and some of the quality control. And so it's not, I'm not advocating, at least for credit courses, I'm not advocating a completely open system. I'm not advocating anarchy at all. I think the instructor needs to change the way she or he thinks about evaluation. But you still have to have certain kind of standards, I think, in mind. And you help the learner come to an understanding of what those standards should be. I mean, I'm still forced at Syracuse University. I would like a different system, but I can't. I'm still forced within a grading system. I have to use a grading system. Fortunately, SU now is on a plus-minus system, which gives you a little more latitude. But I try to work early in a course with learners in the learning contract notion about what kind of a grade level is it that they either want or need or want to shoot for, and then what does it make sense from both in the instructor's viewpoint and from the learner's viewpoint on how you validate and document that you've achieved that grade level. This guy out at University of British Columbia, as an example, when I went out there, he said, you will grade on a curve. This is the only way we grade. We grade on a curve, and so he had, a certain number of people you're going to fail. And I said, I can't do that. I said, if people write their own learning contract and achieve what it is and the student and I mutually agree that that is an acceptable route to achieve the objectives of the course or the derivatives of the objectives that that learner sets up, and they achieve that, they're going to achieve the grade that they're going after. And so in that particular semester, I think I gave no C's. I think it was, they didn't have a plus-minus. I think it was just A's and B's, and so it was a smattering of A's and B's. This guy was just furious, and I know he'll never invite me back as an instructor. In good conscience, though, I could not, as an instructor trying to practice what I preach, I could not penalize someone by giving them an F, a failing grade, if they had achieved what that student and I had agreed was an acceptable route for that particular course. Now, that doesn't mean that you as a critiquer couldn't come in and challenge that particular route. I'm sure that's always possible. But I say academic freedom allows the instructor the latitude to make that decision with. There have been, and some of you, I suppose, will have a problem with this. There have been times when I might have 14 or 15 people in a course, and every one of them will achieve an A. It doesn't happen very often, but I mean sometimes it does, and that's because we have agreed mutually on this individualized process what is going to be the approach and what are going to be the outcomes and what's going to be the method of evaluating that and how you're going to document that, and if everybody achieves that, then I say, why not? Thanks. Yes?
Roger, I don't know anything about adult education, but I was interested going back to your very beginning base of literature. And I understood you say in the late 60s, most of the fundamental ideas about the cross of the two curves between fluid and crystallized were established on longitudinal cohort type of analysis.
Most of it was, yeah.
That literature was primarily drawing on cohorts from the 50s and the 40s.
Yeah, which presents potential problems for today.
An administration is a gigantic problem because our field is split right in the middle in two camps between how far back can you legitimately trace conclusions about the needs of schools and administration. Some arguing that you can only start cold modern from World War II on, and those that take it farther back. But particularly in the sociological thing about cohort, I was trying to think when we were talking all the changes that might impact on not just male and female distinction, but war and peace, times when the cohort would be affected by things that was probably dramatic.
Right.
Are you saying that the literature is stable enough about what is the definition of adults from late 60s on that you all have built on that base with the assumption that that is legitimate, or is that people seriously going back and doing?
There certainly is a lot of challenge to the research, and a lot of people are carrying out refinements of it. Definition of adult certainly is changing some because of the variables you mentioned and other things like health and longevity and all sorts of things. So there are some changes coming. It isn't going to be, I don't think there are going to be dramatic changes. You know, most of this is a fairly stable sort of stuff.
Well, I don't see it stable, but let me take it further. If I trade in on your crystallized versus fluid, it sounds to me that the adult education was rationalized, something that early childhood and a lot of other people argue is a nature-nurture issue, where the crossover between what's fluid and what's crystallized occurs about age 22, 23.
Yeah.
Now, is that related to the sociological graduating from college after 4 years, or is that, I mean, it seems to me that research, the crossover is very neat to the kind of patterning of our society about what it means to become achieving adult roles. And it may be that that's literally just confirming of it, or it may be that one's drawing the other.
Well, I think some of the more current research is showing that the fluid slope is not nearly as dramatic as what was portrayed in that slide was from about a 1974 or 1975 piece. That the fluid, I mean, people, because of what has happened in society in the past 15 years, I think there's some evidence that our innate abilities are stretched out beyond that particular age. And so I suppose that means that people maybe don't have to compensate quite as much as they get older. I'm not sure what all the implications are.
This is what I was thinking you were getting to about making the case for individualized instruction. That adults, there seems to be two parallel sets of phenomena of what adults mean. One is the physiological aspect. It would seem to me, one thing I didn't hear you talk about is male and female differences of what is used as cosmetics or surface level about what identifies age. You mentioned the white beard because you thought you had a baby, which is your ability to do that. Okay, so one half the population doesn't have that.
But we have high growth.
But you have other things. And what I'm saying is that it may well be that those concepts of adultness, getting out of shape, wrinkles, those kind of phenomena about what is an adultness are at least as important about this idea of what wisdom reflects in terms of sociology as the other types of features of actual intellectual capacity and the kind of thing that are drawn on. What I was interested in, because we're in Albany, we're going through a dramatic, I'm sure the whole state, this idea of politics of inclusion and diversity and whatever, is that it seems to be that the sociological aspects of what being an adult means now is going increasingly to things that have differentiated impact on who you are, where you fit in such concepts as employability, retirement, those kind of features, much more than how we are trying to think about the kind of intellectual style or the kind of person we want in our classes. And if that's driving what adult will mean for us in education, maybe those are the kind of factors we should be more triggering on than just trying to look for. I think I'm saying essentially, if I look at your curve where it crosses off, and if I hear you say, don't rely on the genetic, neural, physiological based fluid type of intelligence, but think more on terms of crystallized, experiential, sociological types of things. then I can agree with that as an emphasis. But then I wonder what that really plays out when we're trying to differentiate what it means about older adults.
Well, it seems to me that the individualized instruction, the notion of allowing each individual his or her own path, is a way of, regardless of where they happen to be in innate abilities or on their socialization process or where they happen to be at any age point in terms of physical abilities, you build on that individual wherever she or he is. I mean, this is where I've come in my own teaching, that I think that that's what works.
I agree.
Yeah.
The crossover between self-actualization and existential moment, not that close, right? In
Yeah.
other words, you could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you can't stand in anybody else's democracy, or you work a contractual understanding between you and the other learner, in the final analysis, your whole role is conceding that that person knows best what learning means.
Right.
Is that where you're coming out?
Yeah. I think you've said it better than I did,
And
but
the
that's
older
it.
they get, the more they may have that quality to make self.
Yeah, except that the research would suggest that people kind of move up and down given various kind of life events that come along. And so some particular life event may in fact put you at a different point on any slope, and you have to, the instructor has to be sensitive to some of those differences. But with that exception, yeah, I agree. Good. I like the way it's
Getting older, an episodic type of compressed and then dissipated type of phenomena, or is it this generic sort of longitudinal?
I think it's both. I mean, episodic in that there are various kind of life acts that come along that are going to create unexpected changes, physiological changes, physical changes, loss of spouse, loss of job, retirement, all sorts of things. But on the other hand, it is a continuous sort of thing too. In the aging process means that we are continuing to have expected kind of changes that an instructor ought to pay attention to.
I won't dominate. I'm just thinking of a veteran comes back and says to you, look, I've been through 4 years of so-and-so experience. I pretty well know what I want to do for the next semester. Is there any way you can make an equivalency to a person who's 55 or 60 years old, kind of sort of non-compressed experience as far as knowing more about their life, or better able to judge for the instructor to put more weight or credibility on that conclusion between compressed experience and long, slowly developed?
Well, I see your point. I suppose some instructors would be better able to read what is needed from a qualitative viewpoint to manage the assessment of the need or the development of the learning strategy than others. That's a good point. I mean, I'm not sure that I make quite the qualitative difference in an overt way that you're talking about, or perhaps I do that more intuitively. And I think you're suggesting that there may be more refinements on that an instructor should pay attention to because of the differences.
Does anybody in here teach inner city? Okay, if a person says, I've had 4 years of inner city experience, does that person's values and judgments in terms of what they are projecting as a learning experience differ from a person who says, I've had a relatively stable teaching experience for over 20 years? Is there any way as an instructor you can make an equivalency judgment about which of those two sets of experiences may be more an argument that the learner can better determine what they need? Is there any way you can balance?
No, I see your point. I'm not sure that that I do that, what you're talking about, as in a skillful a way as I would like to. You're causing me to think about that more. As I say it, it's almost an intuitive thing that you do. As I think about the way I work with a student in the classroom, this individual sort of thing, it might take with certain learner some more individual counseling in the development of the learning plan or the learning contract than you would need with others. Good points.